The rain had started as a whisper and turned into a punishment, the kind that soaked through wool coats and pride alike. And Nathaniel Crow noticed it only because it blurred the far fence line of his ranch, the same fence that had stood for 30 years without asking anything of him except silence. And yet that afternoon, through the sheets of rain, he saw a shape moving where nothing ever moved, a small figure bent against the storm, hands working wire where wire had snapped. And for a moment he thought his eyes were betraying him the way they had since his wife died, conjuring ghosts where there were none. But the figure didn't vanish. It struggled, slipped, rose again, and when lightning split the sky, he saw her clearly, a woman. Thin as a fence post herself, hair plastered to her face, dressed too light for the cold, fingers red and shaking as she tied broken wire with a patience that didn't belong to trespassers. Nathaniel Crow was a rich man by every measure that mattered to bankers and land surveyors, owner of more acres than some towns, cattle branded with his mark as far as the river bends. But he was also a lonely man, a widower whose house echoed like an abandoned church, and it angered him in a way he couldn't name that. Someone would be on his land without asking. Fixing something he hadn't noticed was broken, so he pulled his horse around and rode toward her, rain pounding his hat brim, boots heavy with mud. And when she finally looked up at the sound of hooves, fear crossed her face so fast it cut him. Because fear like that came from long practice, not from surprise. She didn't run, though every instinct screamed that she should. She just stood there, shoulders squared, jaw set, like someone who had learned that running only made things worse. And Nathaniel reined in hard, close enough to see how young she was, early 20s maybe, though hardship blurred ages, and how tired. The kind of tired sleep doesn't cure, and he barked, sharper than he meant to. "You're on private land," and she nodded quickly, rain dripping off her chin, voice barely audible over the storm as she said, "I know, sir, I'm sorry." "The fence was down and your cattle—" She gestured vaguely. "They were drifting, I didn't want them to. Get hurt, and something about that, about caring for his cattle more than for herself, knocked the anger sideways inside him. He noticed then the way her hands trembled, not just from cold, the way her shoes were split at the seams, the way her dress clung thin and useless against the rain, and he asked the question that had never once occurred to him. In all his years of ownership, why? And she hesitated, eyes dropping to the mud, before answering with a simple honesty that felt heavier than any lie. Because it needed fixing. And in that moment, with rain soaking them both and the fence half mended between them, Nathaniel Crow felt something stir that had been dead a long time. Respect, maybe, or shame. He dismounted without thinking, coat heavy on his shoulders, and took the wire from her hands, surprising them both, his fingers clumsy but strong as he finished the tie. And when he stood back, she stared at the repaired fence like it was a miracle, whispering, "Thank you," as if he'd done her a kindness instead of the other way around. And that gratitude unsettled him more than anger ever could. He told her she should get out of the rain, that storms like this killed people who didn't have shelter, and she nodded again but didn't move. And when he asked where she was headed, her silence stretched so long the rain seemed to fill it until finally she said, "Nowhere," not dramatically, not with tears, just a fact stated like the weather. And Nathaniel felt the weight of that word settle into his chest, heavier than any loss he remembered. He offered her a ride to town, assuming she'd refuse, assuming pride or fear would win. But she surprised him again by shaking her head and saying softly, "They don't want me there," and something in her voice told him this wasn't self-pity, it was experience. And he realized then that she wasn't passing through. She wasn't a drifter chasing opportunity. She was surviving day by day, wherever the ground didn't immediately reject her. The rain intensified, cold biting now and without asking permission from her or from the part of himself that avoided complications. He told her to get on the horse, holding out a hand, and when she hesitated, he said the words that would haunt him later. "I won't leave you here." And she studied his face like she was searching for the catch, the cruelty that usually followed kindness, but found none. And slowly, carefully, she took his hand, her fingers light, like she expected him to let go at any second. The ride back to the ranch house was quiet, her back rigid in front of him, his coat draped around her shoulders. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, Nathaniel noticed the house lights from far off, not as a reminder of emptiness, but as something that might mean warmth to someone else. And when they reached the porch, rain-soaked and silent, he helped her down, realizing only then how unsteady she was, exhaustion finally claiming its due. And he asked her name, and she said, Clara, like it was a secret, and he told her his, though she already knew. Everyone did, and inside, as he handed her a towel and pointed her toward the kitchen fire, Nathaniel Crow did not yet realize the truth, that Clara hadn't just been fixing his fence. She'd been living along its edges, sleeping where the land allowed, unseen and unwanted, and that by noticing her in the rain, he had stepped across a line far more dangerous than a broken wire, a line that would force him to confront the loneliness he'd buried under wealth and the quiet strength of a woman the world had tried very hard to erase. Morning came softly to the Crow Ranch, not with warmth, but with a pale gray light that crept through tall windows and touched things long left untouched. And Nathaniel Crow woke in his chair by the dying fire, boots still on, realizing with a jolt that the house no longer felt like a mausoleum, that the air carried a human presence different from memory. And when he stood and listened, he heard movement in the kitchen, careful, hesitant, and that sound alone unsettled him more than silence ever had. Clara stood at the stove when he entered, wrapped in one of his late wife's old shawls, stirring oatmeal like it was a privilege instead of necessity. And when she turned, panic flashed briefly before she remembered she was safe, a realization that seemed new enough to startle her. And she said, I didn't want to waste anything, explaining herself the way people do when life has taught them that every kindness comes with strings. Nathaniel waved it off, uncomfortable with gratitude, and told her she could stay until the weather cleared. A lie even as he spoke it, because he already knew the weather wasn't the reason he hadn't asked her to leave. And as the day unfolded, small truths emerged, not all at once, never directly but in fragments. The way broken lives are told, how Clara's parents had died years apart, how she'd worked in kitchens and laundries until sickness stole her wages, how kindness had limits everywhere except in stories, and how sleeping outdoors teaches you to wake at every sound, which was why she flinched when doors closed too, loudly, and why she always sat facing exits. Nathaniel listened more than he spoke, surprised by how much space her words occupied in him, and as he watched her move around the ranch house, cleaning without being asked, repairing what was worn, tending the horses with a gentle authority, he realized with quiet shame that she treated his home with more care than he ever had, because to her it was shelter, not memory. The town found out quickly, as towns always do, that a woman was staying at Crow Ranch, and whispers arrived with the mail, questions masked as concern, and when a deputy rode out under the excuse of checking fences, Nathaniel stood straighter than he had in years, placing himself between Clara and the world with a calm certainty that surprised even him, telling the man she was his guest and would be treated as such. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears she tried to hide, the kind that come when fear loosens its grip for half a second. Days passed, rain gave way to sun, and Clara did not ask to stay, did not ask for work, did not ask for promises, and that restraint weighed on Nathaniel heavier than any demand could have, because it made the truth undeniable. She had nowhere else to go, and he had more than enough room. And in that space between those facts, something fragile and dangerous grew. One evening, as they fixed fence together under a clearing sky, Clara finally said the words that had been pressing against her ribs since the storm. I can leave. And Nathaniel answered without looking up. You don't have to. And the simplicity of it shattered them both, because staying was harder than leaving, and choosing was harder than surviving. The town pushed back, as it always does when old orders shift. But Nathaniel Crow was a man who owned land because he refused to be moved, and he discovered that wealth meant nothing until it was used to protect someone who had none. And as weeks turned into something like peace, Clara grew stronger, laughter returning in cautious pieces, while Nathaniel found himself sleeping through the night for the first time since his wife's death, the house no longer echoing but breathing, and one quiet morning, watching Clara mend a gate in sunlight instead of rain. He understood the truth fully, that she had never been broken, only ignored, and that loneliness had been his greatest poverty, not her homelessness. He offered her more than shelter then, offering dignity, choice, partnership, and when she accepted, not as a dependent, but as a woman who knew her own worth, the ranch changed. The land responding the way living things do when cared for properly, and the fence she had once fixed in the rain stood stronger than before. A quiet monument to the moment two abandoned souls recognized each other. And if the world insists on cruelty, this was proof that mercy still lives in unexpected places, waiting for someone to notice, a figure in the rain, and choose not to look away. The first real test of Clara's place at the Crow Ranch came not with kindness but with confrontation, the kind that rides in on dusty horses and wears righteousness like armor. And it happened on a Sunday afternoon when the town's men arrived uninvited, claiming concern for propriety while their eyes searched for weakness, and Nathaniel stood on his porch listening as they spoke of reputation, of rumors, of how a woman like her did not belong in a man like him's home. And Clara heard every word from inside, hands clenched, ready to disappear the way she always had. But this time, Nathaniel did not allow silence to do the work of cruelty. He spoke calmly, firmly, reminding them that his land was his choices were his, and that the measure of a person was not where they slept last winter, but how they stood when given a chance. And when one man laughed and called Clara charity, Nathaniel's voice dropped to something colder than anger as he said, "Then you should pray. Someone shows you the same mercy. When life decides to take everything," and the men left uneasy, because power backed by conscience is harder to fight than fists. That night, Clara tried to pack, fear old and stubborn whispering that she was a burden, that safety never lasts, and Nathaniel found her at the door with her bundle, rainless sky mirrored in her eyes. And he said, "If you leave, let it be because you choose to, not because they scared you." And she broke then, not weakly, not helplessly, but honestly, admitting that homelessness teaches you to vanish before you're erased. And he answered by giving her something she'd never been handed before: ownership. A small section of land, work that paid fairly, a future not built on permission. Seasons turned, and Clara became a name spoken with respect, not pity. Her skill and steadiness impossible to ignore, while Nathaniel found himself laughing again, not at memories but at the present. The ranch thriving as if it had been waiting for her all along. And one evening, standing by the same fence she had once fixed in the rain, Nathaniel realized the truth that completed the circle. Wealth had not saved Clara, and Clara had not saved him. They had simply seen each other when the world looked away and chosen to stay. When he asked her to build a life with him, not out of rescue but partnership, she said yes with a strength that came from survival and hope combined. And the fence stood firm behind them, no longer a boundary but a beginning. Proof that sometimes the smallest moment, a woman fixing wire in the rain, can quietly rewrite two entire destinies. Years later, when people spoke of the Crow Ranch, they no longer spoke first of its size or wealth, but of the way it felt, like land that had learned how to forgive. And Nathaniel sometimes stood at the edge of the property at dusk watching the fences, stretched clean and strong across the fields, remembering the night rain blurred his vision and revealed a woman the world had tried to erase. Clara had changed the ranch not by force but by presence, by insisting that work deserved dignity and shelter deserved warmth, hiring those the town overlooked, feeding those who worked hard and asked little, and slowly, quietly, the place became known as somewhere second chances were real, not promised. Nathaniel aged into a man whose silence now carried peace instead of grief, and Clara aged into confidence, her laughter easy, her strength unquestioned, and together they proved something the town never expected, that charity. Without respect is humiliation, but opportunity with trust builds miracles. The house that once echoed with loss now held voices, stories, and shared meals, and sometimes travelers arrived in the rain, drawn by rumor or desperation. And Clara would be the first to see them at the fence line, because she never forgot what it meant to stand there unseen, and she always said the same thing Nathaniel once said to her: "Come in first," and the fence, the same one that brought them, together, stood not as a barrier, but as a reminder. A quiet line marking the moment kindness chose courage over comfort. And when people asked Nathaniel what the richest thing he ever owned was, he never mentioned land or cattle, only smiled and said, "The day I noticed her, because some fortunes don't sit in banks or barns. They live in moments when you look twice, act once, and change a life, including your own, forever long." After the storms that first brought Clara to the fence had faded, into memory, the ranch continued to receive visitors who never planned to stay, and yet somehow always did, drawn by something they couldn't name, and Clara understood them better than anyone, because she recognized the look in their eyes, the guarded hope, the readiness to be turned away, and she met each one with the same calm assurance, teaching them that survival was not the same as living. Nathaniel watched all this with quiet pride, aware that the wealth he once guarded so fiercely had finally found purpose, not in possession but in protection. And sometimes, late at night, when the house settled and the land breathed around them, he would admit to Clara that if he hadn't ridden out that day, if he had chosen comfort over curiosity, his life would have ended rich and empty, and Clara would answer with a truth shaped by years. Without shelter, that being seen can save you more completely than being fed. The fence they repaired together became a lesson passed down to new hands, a story told to children about how lines meant to divide can become places of meeting. And when Clara stood in the rain again years later, this time watching workers fix storm damage with laughter instead of desperation, she smiled, knowing she had crossed from surviving to belonging. And if the world outside the ranch remained harsh, and it often did, the Crowland stood as proof that one choice, one moment of noticing, could ripple outward into dozens of lives changed, reminding anyone who heard the story that kindness does not require perfection, only courage, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stop, look twice, and refuse to walk away.